Welcome, everybody, and thank you for the introduction there, Brittany. Much appreciated. Yeah, I come as an FSO, Facility Security Officer, of right about 17 years. I've been with Squadron Defense Group. The beginning of next month will make, be 14 years. So an FSO for a big company to start, and then I moved into small and medium-sized companies, and now the consultant firm working with all size companies across the domain of defense, the intelligence community, Department of Energy. So a lot of different areas of focus when it comes to personal clearances, and I want to try and take all those different ties that I have and the experience with many different people in many different situations to kind of give you guys a high-level overview of this process. There are some things that are changing in the near future, but this briefing, this session really focuses on what I can speak to officially. It was originally written in October and November of last year. There's a lot of things that are about to happen or that are happening, but it's not official yet. So I've kept these slides the same for the session this morning and this afternoon session, the same that was done previously, the tail end of last year. But where I can maybe pepper in some of the likely changes, I'll let you guys know that. But as stated, please try as best you can to hold off on the questions, only because ideally I am going to cover it, or I got some questions last session this morning. I will try to pepper those in here as well in an effort to maybe alleviate some of the concerns that might exist there. But let's start with the basic thing here first. What is a security clearance? A security clearance, in layman's terms, is the government deciding that you as an individual are trustworthy enough to be granted access to classified information. And they do this by conducting a background investigation on you as an individual based on a specific criteria of data points. And we're going to cover all of that today. In order for you to go through this process, the first thing that we really have to focus on is having an actual need. And with need, typically the phrase is need to know. That normally ties into you're working on a classified contract. Now, that either means that you're working a classified contract with a federal contractor, or that you're working within the federal space as a government employee and you need access to classified. So that typically is where we refer to those. We also have the other side of this, is being that if you were in the military, oftentimes you have to get a clearance as well, though not in all cases. So once we know what a security clearance is, then begins the question immediately thereafter of who can get one. And not just anybody can. There's a lot of different reasons why somebody could and a lot of different reasons why somebody cannot. But in order to get one, there's a couple of basic premises that need to exist. I already stated the first one. You've got to be working on a contract where you're going to need access to classified and performance of your duties. Then the second piece of that becomes about you as a person. And are you going to be deemed trustworthy enough? And the very first piece of that is, are you a U.S. citizen or not? And if the answer to that question is no, then for all intent and purposes, you really can't have a clearance. But if you are a U.S. citizen, you have valid need to know, now you've met those first two criteria points, and we can begin to go down the path. Now, typically speaking, if I'm talking in a session like this, I'm going to be talking to people who are going to be working in industry and are going to be going to the government as a federal contractor. And one thing that I forgot to mention in the last session, but that I will make sure I mention here now, especially since both are being recorded, we can get this in, is that you as an individual are not paying for this clearance. Your company who might be putting you in for the clearance, they are not paying for this clearance. You don't have money that is allocated in that sense that you have to pay into. Now, the taxpayer, and thus you are paying for the clearance investigations, let's admit that, but you don't have to fork out money to do this. I'll clear out a couple of other things as I go there, but I had neglected the last session. I want to make sure I did it here. As we move in there, the next piece of this puzzle that I want to clear up, I want to give you a tool here, is that you can actually be a dual citizen and get a clearance. It does not mean that because you were a foreign birth that you could not get a clearance, nor does it mean that you have to give up that other citizenship. per se. There are instances where that will come into place. You'll see here that I say some contracts will not allow for dual citizenship. You also see that there's about a U.S. person, vice U.S. citizenship, and I mentioned ITAR. ITAR standing for the International Trade and Arms Regulation. So with those two things that we have there, this really starts the process of separating who's viable to get a clearance and who's not, but at the same time there are misconceptions. And one of the misconceptions I can now clear up very emphatically is that you can be a dual citizen and get a clearance. What comes into play is who you are, what you would be getting access to, who your contacts might be, family members, friends, past coworkers that might exist in the home country, as well as who is the home country, and what those individuals with which you would still associate in the mother country, what do they do? You could imagine that if someone is in an intel job with the Pakistani government and you're going to be working at the CIA, okay, now I've got some problems here in the eyes of the government. They're probably going to say no. But if you happen to have somebody who is working in Japan with Toyota, and you are, on the other hand, going to be working as an admin at the Pentagon related to network accesses, there's probably no tie there. It's not going to be a concern per se. So it is much more about you, the individual, much more about your contacts, what you do, what they do, that will come into play as a factor. But you can be a dual citizen. The one kind of caveat I put in there as a key point to remember is that this tends to be you were a citizen of a foreign country and now you're coming into the U.S. And with that, you're showing your foreign preference kind of is now shifting to the U.S. But if you were to go get citizenship in a foreign country and you were already a U.S. citizen and already cleared, that begets a series of questions that will need to be potentially mitigated. I do speak on the bottom of the slide to what is called a limited access authority, or an LAA. In exceedingly rare instances, a foreign national could potentially be granted a security clearance. In order for this to be the case, the individual must have a skill set so unique and so desirable to the U.S. government that said skill set can't be found via a U.S. citizen currently. This would be something akin to the maker of the widget being someone from, let's say, Brazil. No one else in the world knows how to create this product. No one else in the world has the know-how, and we need this product in our government space. We would likely, at that point, clear that individual in order to do this. Typically speaking, an LAA is only going to be granted if we're talking about someone in theater of war and in the operations scheme therein. And that's so that whoever is the warfighter with me in my foxhole has an idea of what the plan is, and it might not be a U.S. person. It might be someone from, say, the U.K., Australia, what have you. So that's typically where it comes into play. But there are abilities for this to happen. I will tell you that in a 17-plus year security career, I've seen it happen twice. And I've never gotten one approved, and I have submitted multiple occasions. They finally come back and said, no, there's just no way. The key example that I would give, you're a translation company, you've got somebody who speaks Farsi, and you try to get them a clearance. The government customer says, no, that's not happening. Go to Dearborn, Michigan, where there is a large contingent of individuals who speak Farsi, and you could probably find somebody who can get a clearance. Those types of things definitely come into play. Now, with a security clearance, the next question becomes, what type of clearance? What would I be going in for, and why do I get one level vice another? And there are three basic personal clearances, three basic levels of classification for the U.S. government: confidential, secret, and top secret. If we are in the DOE, you'll see Q and L listed as well. An L clearance would equate to a secret with the DOE, and a Q with top secret. And while I am talking to academia in essence today, one might think when saying DOE, I'm referring to the Department of Education. That is not the case typically in the security community. When referring to DOE in this instance, I'm referring to the Department of Energy. They are some of the ones who deal with clearance issues in a much more high level set there. So these are the basic three with the two caveated at that point. And then we have to focus on, well, why do we have these three levels? Why would I classify something at one level versus another? And we start with, what's the potential damage to national security if this information gets out? And if there's something that's identifiably dangerous, okay, some damage could happen, we're going to call it confidential. If serious damage to national security could be put in place, that's when we go with a secret. And then exceptionally grave danger comes in. If that comes into play, now we do this, I call it top secret. To that end, a very basic example that I can give that a lot of people may still remember, or at least have heard of, was during the initial stages of the Second Iraq War, where Geraldo Rivera is sitting there with Fox News. He's embedded with a military unit. He sits there and, while on screen, draws a map and draws a kind of haphazard map of Iraq, and then puts the stick down and says, "I'm here." Now, as he's doing that, he's already stated, and it's already on the screen, the military unit he is embedded with. So now we know he's in Iraq, a general sense of where he's at and who he is actually embedded with. So to that end, we can figure out some other things about the mission, potentially, or what that unit does. And so that could be treated as secret. Now, if he had said what the actual mission was and a true location of where he was at, that might have been treated as top secret. You can look at this in kind of a basic setting for you as a person. Me having your name, me knowing your employer, I might be able to do something then with an identifiable risk. But if I had your credit card, I could do some damage. If I have your full name, your date of birth, your place of birth, your birth certificate, which means I have your mother's maiden name, I can steal your identity and wreak havoc. That would be kind of top secret if we look in the context of an everyday life. To that end, we also look at how often and how far back do we go when we're clearing an individual. Really, no one's getting cleared at the confidential level anymore. Get cleared secret and above. Confidential, we're not even setting material at the confidential level very often anymore. As things are downgraded, they might drop down to confidential. Pretty much, if it needs to be classified, you've got to be able to demonstrate that serious damage to national security is going to be there, and we consider it secret or above. But confidential does still exist. If you are going for a secret or confidential clearance, you are going to go back no less than 7 years in every section of the form that we'll talk about, called the SF-86. And you'll have that done every 15 years on a confidential clearance and every 10 years at the secret. But typically speaking, if you're cleared confidential, they want you to have your reinvestigation every 10. Now, if you're going for a top secret clearance, that is done every 5 years, and you go back 10 years. Now, due to backlogs that have existed for a period of time that we're desperately trying to get through, we're pretty caught up at this point. What I will say is that right now, for a top secret reinvestigation, that's being done every 6 years. Having just said that you got to go back at least 7 years for secret and 10 years for the TS, there are some questions, and I'll speak to some of that a little bit later as well, which are for life. And also, they have to look at, from the government space, how old you are currently, because it's either 7 or 10 years that you're going back for the vast majority of the questions, or until your 18th birthday. So if I'm 22, I don't have to go back until I'm 15 or until I'm 12. I go back to my 18th birthday. So there's a few things within that that we have some caveats to it. As well, I will speak to the fact that the clearance program is being overhauled. It is being overhauled because of the current world that we live in. and the fact that the current rules we're operating under were actually written in the 1940s and 1950s. To that end, why somebody turned against us, what needed to be looked at, how we would look at the individuals, how long it would take to get that data has vastly changed in 70 plus years. So to that end, we are starting to see what's called continuous evaluation, and we're going to change how someone is looked at and when they are looked at. And with that frequency, it will also change how often a reinvestigation may need to be done and if one needs to be done again. So there are a lot of changes afoot, but that's not official in many instances, so I didn't speak to it too much here in terms of putting it in writing. Now, I will also state that there are other avenues which someone could get cleared, or that there's additional caveats to data. People watching spy movies may hear different terms that exist, but really, confidential, secret, top secret. If something needs to be protected, but it is not really classified, that you might hear the term in the near future of CUI, or controlled unclassified information. It's data that needs to be protected. But to that end, people who aren't cleared could potentially get that data. Now, there's also instances where just the fact that you're in a government space means you might have to have what equates to a hall pass. Well, to do that, we have to have some sort of background investigation. That will be what is known as a position of trust. You might hear it as suitability or favorability. You have to go through a background investigation, but it's not necessarily at the level of even a confidential clearance. Now, from there, we start getting to the special things, the real juicy stuff, if you will. Within the intelligence community, or the IC, we have what is known as sensitive compartmented information, or you might hear it instead as sensitive compartmentalized information, and then there are caveats within. But that is known as SCI. Within the really the special forces side of the U.S. military, there are some additional types of information protections, and that would be known as Special Access Program. So SCI or SAP. And in order to be in spaces where that information is there, in order to be able to be given access, you have to go in special rooms that are built to these very, very in-depth specifications to include sound attenuation and other areas of concern, so people aren't eavesdropping. And then we get into, in order to get to those SAP levels, or in order to get to those SCI levels, you would have to have a polygraph done on you. And there's really three types that exist. There really only two are done these days. The first one is a CI, or counterintelligence poly. The next is a lifestyle. And then the third is a blend of the two that's called a full scope. Due to changes in what we deem as a potential concern, having changed drastically over the course of many decades now, some of the areas that would have been a concern with a lifestyle, those are gone. For example, those within the LGBTQ community, that would have been potentially an automatic, nope, can't get cleared, no ifs, ands, or buts, no. That is not the case at all any longer. And really, that kind of negated a lot of the use of why some people would even need to go through a lifestyle poly. So we're not seeing as many of those happen anymore. The question really from a lifestyle side, and most of what goes into a counter-intel side when we're looking at things in general, is can you be blackmailed? And if you can't be blackmailed, well, then what's the big deal? That's kind of the way it would be looked upon. So that is a massive, massive shift, and a very positive shift in many ways, because in an overall sense, what was happening in the cleared space and really in the federal government is a lot of people who had brilliant skill sets that were needed were not able to perform services just based on a misinterpretation of things or the way society was at that time. That is not the case now. And simply put, you being a dual citizen, you being in the LGBT community, you being a certain race, you being a certain height, you being a certain age, any of those things cannot be used against you from an employment status, and it cannot be used against you here in that status. It has to be upon you as a person. Are you trustworthy? And if that's the case, then ideally the answer is you're going to get a clearance. Having said that, we have a process that you go through. I already mentioned one thing in particular, and that is you're not paying for it. You yourself. The next piece that I will say before we get started with all of this is for a basic personnel clearance at even up to the SCI and SAP levels that I mentioned, you are not being drug tested. There's no urinalysis check. There's no blood being drawn for that. There's no spinal tap being done for that. None of these crazy things that people have said in the past doesn't happen. If you were to have to go through anything related to a drug screening, that would be pursuant to employment, but not to the clearance, at least when it comes to industry, of which I can speak. Could there be something from the government side? It's possible, but I'm giving in essence here, a caveat I also want to say is I'm giving the DOD process. I'm not giving process for other agencies per se in an overall sense, although many of them are going to follow the same path. There might be a little bit of difference in how things get started, but the same basic path we're going to talk about is going to go through here. I do know that there are some differences with how our friends at Langley and the CIA will do some things. They do not necessarily take the same IT accesses that we do, bring that into play. The Department of State does things the same way that I'm mentioning. In some instances, they go a different approach in another way. The DOE does things a little bit differently as well. But from a Defense Department side and a standard DOD contractor side, what's going to happen is your program manager, your hiring manager is going to determine that based on your skill sets, based on what you bring to the table, the contract that you're going to be working on requires access to classified. We're going to put you in for the clearance. So they're going to call me up as your facility security officer and say, hey, I need Jane Doe, I need John Doe cleared. Let's get them started. I'm going to, at that point, create the record in a database called JPass. JPass is going away. It's going to change to a database called DISS, D-I-S-S. No idea why they called it that, but there it is. But in JPass and subsequently in DISS, I'm going to start the application process. And at that time, what's going to happen is I'm going to open up a portal to you to a database run by OPM called EQIP, E-QIP. It will, in the near future, be replaced, although we don't have a date. EQIP will eventually be replaced by E-App or E-Application. And what's going to happen is that you're going to go into this database, you're going to fill out your clearance application on a form that is known as the SF-86. And as I mentioned, 7 years, going back 7 years for the secret, and confidential going back 10 years for the TS. You're going to fill all of that out about who you are. We'll talk about some of those things in the next few slides. You're also going to submit fingerprint cards. Then as things are submitted from you to me, what I would then do as your security officer is review the form for accuracy and completeness. I am not reviewing this to determine whether or not you can get cleared. I can't use this against you. I can't, if I see that you smoke pot, I can't go running. If Tiffany's your boss, I can't go running and say, you are not going to believe what Jane Doe did. Last week, she reported last weekend she got arrested because she was smoking pot with Kim Jong-un. Can't do it. I can go to her and say, Tiffany, I've spoken with Jane Doe, and based on the review of the SF-86 and some concerns I raised with her, she's decided to not go through this process. I can't tell you why. I can't go running and crying wolf. Not a lot. I am under the, as I review that, I'm tied to the Privacy Act. So when I'm reviewing these forms, it's to make sure you've answered each question. And admittedly, I will also go through it, and if I see, based on my experience, that there might be an area of concern because you haven't provided a decent explanation that could alleviate questions, if I go back, I can reach out to you and say, hey, it might make sense for you to elaborate on this. And then you could do what you want to do at that point, but I'm only reviewing it for accuracy and completeness purposes. Then once I submit the application on your behalf to the federal government, what was happening was that it was going direct to OPM, and they reviewed the form, they accepted the form, and then it will be shifted off to the background investigation entity. Now, a very recent change here is that the NBIB, or the National Background Investigation Bureau, was the one that was running all of the DoD background investigations. OPM was running for other entities. It's been going on since 2015 after the data breach. Now with the NBIB, they have now as an entity merged with the Defense Security Service, who handles personal clearances, handles facility clearances, clearance for a company. The NBIB and DSS merged into an entity called DCSA. DCSA, run all the investigations and do the adjudications on the DoD space. OPM still runs investigations for other agencies and could be running one that would be done for an agency you're working with. So I have left for step 5 that process the way it is right now, but it could alter based on where you're at. Once the form's submitted, once the form's approved, the investigation will begin. And in many instances, you might be granted an interim clearance at the start. You might not, but ideally you'd be granted an interim. The investigation goes forward, you'll have subject interviews, and eventually the investigation will close. The adjudication phase begins. Investigation paperwork goes to the adjudicators, they review and determine whether or not you can be granted final clearance access. If you can, great, start getting you briefed, get you read in, get you on site. If you can't, then we go through a couple of things that I will speak at the end of this. A very unique piece, and I should have said this in the last session, and doom on me for not, but I'll say it here for sure. Due to COVID-19, we are seeing where all of the interviews, the subject interviews, are being done by phone and potentially via video teleconference, but it is not being done in person in the short term. That is to protect you. That is to protect the investigators who would be conducting the interview. So it should be done that you have an in-person interview, but there are instances right now that because of COVID-19, it would be done by phone or it would be done by video conference. I do not know when that will stop, but that could be the case by the time you might go through this. Now, what are they looking for? Now we got okay, here's the basic process. But now it's, how do they make a determination that you can be granted access to classified? When they clear a person, they being the US government, they have to look at who the total you is. Not one aspect of you, but what truly makes up each of us. And it's on a case-by-case basis. Now with that, they have 13 basic criteria points called the 13 Adjudicative Guidelines that they look at. And just because you have a tick or a mark on you in one aspect doesn't mean that you won't get a clearance. It means that that's something they need to look at. It's something that they need to validate, see if there's mitigating circumstances, see if there's not, and then we go from there. Just because you are an individual who did something wrong in your teens or early 20s doesn't mean that now in your late 20s and 30s on up couldn't get a clearance. The government understands people make mistakes. It's the level of said mistake or said mistakes that can be a concern. But with these adjudicative guidelines, what they are trying to create and looking at your clearance application, they're trying to look at the whole of who you are, and they use what is known as a whole person concept. Once they use that, that's where that whole shift could be that, all right, somebody might have done something wrong, but there's many things that they did right, and we're going to move from there. So here are, as we look, the 13 adjudicative guidelines. Some of these tie in directly to each other. Some of these are wholly separate. You'll notice that the first 3 are related to foreign ties and allegiance to the U.S. As one can imagine, if you're beholden to a foreign government, that's going to be considered a no-no. But in other cases, you doing one thing might hit several of these categories, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't get a clearance. So if I'm, for example, someone who had bankruptcy, well, that does show financial considerations, but that doesn't mean that there's anything else that's tied there. Just the same, if I get a DUI, well, that's alcohol issues, that's criminal conduct, outside activities. there's 3 or 4 that might hit on a given subject, but it's only treated as one issue in that standard sense. It might be a pretty big issue, but having said that piece, as I mentioned before, that they're revamping the clearance program in an overall sense, there is a look at what exists here, and if these need to be treated separately, or if there's some of these that need to blend together. Why do we need 3 different versions of adjudicated guidelines related to foreign ties? Shouldn't it be all in one? So that might be something that they look at and combine. That's just a potential. I know nothing that would say differently. Just the same as some of these other pieces. When you look at substance abuse, really is in multiple places. Maybe it's just one. That's kind of what Richard Ray do. Doesn't mean it's right. Going to speak on a couple of these, just so you kind of have some ideas of what we're looking for here and what might matter. Finances are always a concern. And the reason that finances are a concern is that over time, finances have either proven to be the #1 reason someone turned, and or financial windfall through them turning really led to us finding the person. Specifically put, the reason we found Aldrich Ames and all the damage that he did was through finances. It's not the #1 reason anymore, but it's a pretty big reason somebody has turned, historically speaking. So this is where we tie to it. Some of this easily mitigated. Some of this can't be mitigated. And when it can't be mitigated, now we have our issue. So what you see here is you going above your means, you having an inability to pay off those debts that you have, you shirking your responsibilities. These can create concerns. Now, having said that, there's obviously a difference between good debt and bad debt. Bad debt means I'm not able to pay my debt. Good debt, if I have a mortgage, if I have my student loans, if I have a car note, and I'm paying all of them on time, then it's not bad debt. Now it's not a problem. So it's not about, oh, I have ... amount of money tied up in financing. It's, oh, I have ... amount of money in financing and I can't pay it. They also have to look at how things are happening for you and what led to those circumstances. It's great that you won the lottery, but it's bad if you don't report the lottery, you don't pay your taxes. Okay, that you can understand. If you're not going to pay your taxes, you're obviously not following the rules. Therefore, you don't need access classified, because the assumption would be you would break those rules and how to protect it. So a couple of things we look at here for what could be disqualifying. You can't pay your debts, or in many cases, you're unwilling to pay your debts. You might not be able to pay your debts because you lost your job, but you've done all you can to pay your debts. Maybe you're paying some, but you're not paying others. They have to look at that, especially after the dot-com crash, the housing bubble crash, the banking issue that we had as the tail end of the Bush administration going into the Obama administration. That really led to a lot of looking at what we were considering an issue, especially in the cleared space, and whether or not that meant somebody couldn't continue to have their clearance. And there's a lot of individuals who became bankrupt in that time frame that were able to keep their clearances. What they had to look at, and what they and are continuing to now look at, what led to this financial concern. Was this something that happened because you did it, or was it something that happened because of something completely outside of your control? If you lost your job because your company lost the contracts and they downsized, that wasn't because you did something to get fired. Okay. Did you go pay your bills? Did you do as best you could? And then you got to a point of, okay, I can feed my children or I can pay my mortgage. If you chose to feed your children so they stay alive, the government's going to look at that in a more positive light than I just didn't pay my mortgage. That's what kind of happens as we move forward here from doing a disqualification side to now the better part being mitigation side. The other part of this also is about how long ago did something happen? And that's a mitigating factor for all instances. Something that happened in the last couple of days, you're not going to be able to demonstrate you've made a change that's lasting. But something 3, 4 years ago, 5, 10, 20 years ago that might have happened to you, that demonstrates you've had a change in that you've adapted, you've fixed potentially the glitch, so to speak. And that's something that's definitely moving forward. Maybe you became bankrupt, or excuse me, maybe you chose to go to go through bankruptcy proceedings because that was the smartest thing that you and your ex could do as you were going through divorce. Okay, that's probably going to be considered something that's okay. Maybe there is a wage garnishment that's going on for you, not because you failed to pay something, but you chose to get your wages garnished so that that bill was paid automatically. We definitely see that in the event of alimony and child support, that some states, including the Commonwealth of Virginia, are basically dictating that that happen now in the event of divorce. So I didn't do anything wrong to have that wage garnishment established, but my wages have been garnished. So they would look at first and go, oh, this wage garnishment, that's bad. Wait a minute, this is the context that it's in, not a problem, we're gonna move on, divide and conquer onto something else. So that is where these things piece together. And just on a finance side, you can see a couple things that definitely are looked at differently now than they might have been before. At one point, if you were going bankrupt, it was a death knell. Now it is not. It is more about, did you pay? Did you do what you could? You went down this path because it was the smartest decision one could make. And if you did that, you made it so that you couldn't be blackmailed. That's what they definitely want to see. When it comes to alcohol consumption and when it comes to substance abuse in general, so the drug side of this as well, for these two, and I'm going to lump them together, this in part is a concern related to control and related to what would one do if one is not of sound mind and body. And yes, I can sit there and raise my hand and say, but wait a minute, just going and getting drunk doesn't mean that means I'm not of sound mind and body at that time. True. But there is a difference between someone tying one on every once in a while and somebody drinking a fifth of scotch every night until they pass out drunk. What happens at that point? You're at the behest of the bottle. You're not thinking straight, and that's what comes into play in that instance. So there's a different, it's the levels of. Now, I will also say you definitely have to look at if and when you get a clearance, you definitely have to look at where you are when you're doing certain things, because it can definitely cause issues. And alcohol has also been used by our adversaries as a method to get in to talk to somebody. It's called social engineering and elicitation. Now, with these things, obviously the first concern is that you have this habit that defines you at that point. And yes, in many instances, I know some people will say, well, I drink, but I'm not an alcoholic. And then somebody who says they're alcoholic, I'm always an alcoholic, I'm in recovery. But there are some people who kind of make that a defining statement, but that doesn't mean that's all you are. And especially if you had a problem in the past and you have gone through rehab and over time you've demonstrated that you have not had a relapse, then it's not going to be as big of an issue per se. It might not be an issue at all. Part of it being, did you go and get help? If you're not getting help, it is creating problems. That's where these other things come into play. And a lot of times when it comes to substance abuse in an overall sense, what has been found in the government space is that because someone is not of sound mind and body, they are not following the security protocols that are put in place. They might forget to lock the safe. They might forget to lock the room. They might let somebody into a space who's not supposed to be in the space. They might say something they wouldn't typically said in other instances. The saying, loose lips sink ships, is very true when we look back in theater of war, World War I, World War II type of thing. So when it comes to, when we look at what is going on for substance abuse in general, going to treatment is not considered a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. The question would be, how long ago was it? Because we really get into how long ago, and did you really demonstrate a change in your lifestyle? And if the answer is yes, then they'll probably move on. If the answer is no, they might say, well, it's no for now, but come back. Let's look at this in a couple of years as you've continued to demonstrate that it's not an issue. Now, the piece with drugs, and why I didn't just immediately lump it all in together, is that we are in this new world where many states in the U.S. have legalized marijuana. If not the state, then maybe the county or the city government has. And as that is happening, we have this debate, of course, state versus federal. Drug use is still illegal at the federal side. We know right now that marijuana is still deemed a controlled substance. Will it be legal one day? Don't know. The federal side, I mean. But you're going in for a security clearance with the U.S. government, and at that point, federal law trumps state law. That's where we have some of these pieces. So what has to happen now on the drug side, specific to marijuana at least, is what state were you in when you did it? How long ago was it? What did you do? That creates some of the issues. If I'm using myself as an example, if I fill out my form today, it's been 20 plus years since I smoked marijuana for the first time, let alone the last time. It's not even something I have to raise on the form. But when I first went through my clearance process, it had been inside of 5 years. I think it was actually 4, almost to the day, in fact. It was a little weird. But I fill my form out. I say that I did it. It doesn't officially ask for the reason, but my FSO at the time said, look, they want to know what you did, when you did it, why you did it. They want to know why you stopped, and they want to know what you're doing to stay stopped. And I said, look, fresh out of the Navy, never thought I'd work in the government, was, hey, I'm going to go, I'm at a party, it was offered, sure, I can't be drug tested, I'll smoke it. Then I realized, all right, it's time to grow up, time to get a real job. Okay, I can't do certain things anymore. I need to act a little bit differently. I made a New Year's resolution. Well, at that point, I'm saying, look, it's 4 some odd years was a New Year's resolution that I did this. But I said at that point, look, I haven't smoked in 4 plus years, and I reiterated, I stopped associating with some people because that's all I really knew them with. That showed time, that showed a change in lifestyle, that showed me moving on from other things. They didn't use that as a problem for me at that point. I was able to get a clearance. But that is something that they need to consider. And obviously, as one can imagine, there's also going to be different drugs that are going to be treated differently. And what you are doing in the spectrum of drug use. So when we're talking about drug use and marijuana, I want to put that aside because of how I talked about it. You can imagine people selling drugs, manufacturing drugs, distributing drugs, and then the type of drug that it is are going to create bigger concerns. But as part of this, it's really, we have to look at how long ago it was in some instances. Now, when it comes to IT, and I understand some people here may be tied to an IT career, the issue here, as one can imagine, really relates to hacking and not following company procedures, not following school procedures when it comes to protecting the IT system or systems that you would have access to. If you're willing to break those laws, if you're willing to break those policies and procedures, that really means that there is a sizable chance you might break other policies and procedures. That creates some of the problems. It's one thing for you to be a network admin for a company and to grant or remove access as appropriate, or for you to be spiteful and just shut somebody's email down for the day. That's unethical. That's where it's going to be a problem. Now, with some of these things, how long ago was it? We have that aspect, and we've all heard stories of the hacker who got busted and now is working with the U.S. government to stop other hackers. So they can look at over time what has happened, who you are, what you do. Things can definitely change, and as well, they always have to look at, look, did I take this action because I thought this is what I was supposed to do, and it turned out to be the wrong thing. When I started in security, for example, I was a physical security specialist, so I put the card readers on the wall. I would make your badge type of thing. Well, if I was told that somebody was leaving the company and I'm supposed to turn the badge off on ... day, and I do it, and then that person doesn't leave, but I didn't get that note, I didn't do that unknowingly. I didn't know that that badge wasn't supposed to be shut off anymore. That's different than me willy-nilly just blocking you from getting into that space. So that's kind of a context point. There are other reasons people could be are looked at, but those are some pretty good instances that I can speak of, and really that a lot of times answer a lot of the questions that might exist there. When it comes to you possibly getting denied, let's start first with the aspect of, I'm going to start with no clearance at all. And if I'm going for a TS or I'm going for a secret, it's not like I'm just going to get a final clearance right away. I'm going to go in stages. I'm going to start at the interim level. And ideally, I'm granted an interim clearance. So I would go interim secret, then maybe bump up to interim TS, and then the final. If I am denied an interim clearance, that does not mean that I would be denied a final clearance. In fact, in almost all cases, that's not the case, although it can be. But oftentimes what happens is somebody is granted an interim clearance and then things are uncovered during the course of the investigation and it's decided, no, I can't give that person a clearance. So then that clearance is revoked or denied. But when you are denied an interim clearance, all it really means is that at the start, we need more information before we can have comfort in granting you access to classified. During the course of an investigation, they may uncover it and they may even lift that interim declination and grant you a clearance. That has happened plenty of times in my career that I have seen that with individuals. Then from there, if they have a concern with the investigation that has closed and the data that's contained therein, and they don't feel comfortable granting access initially, they will issue through your FSO to you a statement of reasons package, which will point to every area of concern under the adjudicative guidelines that they might have and afford you a chance to state the facts more clearly, present additional evidence that might help your case, and then at that point, you would be able to ideally get a clearance. Now, two things will happen there. First is you will be given the chance to write the answers, and then the second is that you're given a chance to go before an adjudicative panel or leave it in black and white. Go before the panel. Don't leave it to black and white because you don't get the inflection. They don't understand what's going on, why you value this, why this isn't a concern, and why you don't believe it could be used against you because you're going up and speaking in front of a group of people. There again, if you do get denied, you get the chance to appeal. If you get the chance to appeal. By all means, you want to appeal. It shows how serious you are. And just because I get denied doesn't mean that I can't get a clearance. That is a yes and no answer. I hate to say it, but it is yes and no. Based upon the reason why you would be denied the clearance, you will be given a letter which will state we're denying or we're revoking your clearance, and then it will tell you if you can ever reapply. Typically speaking, if you're denied a clearance, it's only for 1 year and then you can go back in. I am here to tell you personally, you can be denied a clearance or have it revoked and then get it back. I had my clearance denied at one point. I ended up with 3 strikes against me. One, because I forgot to mail in my taxes 1 year. Totally screwed that up. I still to this day don't know how that happened. But between the marijuana and that one, and then an IT incident where I had emails sent that were not sent the right way, and boom, there I go. So 3 strikes and I'm out. I chose to go in black and white, what was written down on paper, and I didn't go before the judge. Had I gone before the judge, I probably would have had no issues there at all, but I didn't. When I reapplied, I made sure to state, hey, here's what's going on with this, and here's why it's not a problem. And one of the reasons I said it wasn't a problem was that I actually speak at events and actually say, hey, look, here's what happened to me. Here's why you don't want to do X, Y, Z. That removed any reason for blackmail. That's awesome. Then I was able to get my clearance back. So you can get your clearance back if you were denied, and if it was revoked. And if it's denied, you can go through the appeal process. But one thing that I say in any session that I do when it comes to clearances, if you are given the chance, if you are told you can go before an adjudicative panel, go before the panel. And if you were told that you are denied or revoked for your clearance, appeal it. If nothing else, it shows how serious you take this, and that will actually help in the long run. That is the basic premise of this briefing. We had a couple of questions that came in last session that I tried to move forward here, this one, and then a couple of the questions that came in early today. 2 of them tied to foreign countries. One was because someone has a spouse or a partner who is a foreign national, and in that case it was China, and then someone said that they've lived in China for the last 7 years. I'm not going to focus on the China part with that. I'm simply going to say Any country creates a problem there to a degree. It's that you have those foreign contacts, you have potentially foreign family members, and it becomes a question of loyalty. So it needs to be looked upon. What do you do? What do they do? What do you access? What would they access? What are their ties to the foreign government, foreign company, what have you, that factor in? That gets to the foreign preference, foreign allegiance aspect of it. That's irrespective of the country, though I will say you can imagine there are some difficulties when we talk about countries like Russia and China. But each case is based on its own merit. There was also a couple of questions related to a few other things within all of this. And one of them, if I remember correctly, the question came in about if I'm a employee, if I'm self-employed, am I able to actually get a clearance at one point in time? If I had been, how would I validate that? The question there comes in, and I say, look, if you were self-employed at one period of time, employment can still be validated by like a CPA, a client that you might have had at the time. They could do those things. It might even be a spouse or family member that could do that. Just the same with unemployment. If you're unemployed for a period of time, it's okay. It happens. And then sometimes it's not by choice, and sometimes it is by choice, but we can get that validated without any real problem. I'm not seeing that other questions have really come in too much, but I do see that there is one. It comes from where to apply for it. That's going to be through the employer, or it's going to be through the federal government in and of itself. You're going to be working with either a current company or you're going to be a contingent hire, and that's what's going to lead to you being able to obtain the clearance, or ideally to obtain the clearance. But it's all going to start based on a contractual obligation. Everything is centered there. There were questions this morning as well about your criminal background, and is that a concern? It depends upon the criminal background in and of itself. First and foremost, was it a misdemeanor? Was it a felony? Felony, depending upon the felony and how long ago it was, the time that was served or not served could factor in. In a lot of cases, a felony would be, nope, can't do it. But that's not necessarily the case anymore at the level that it was. Just because you were charged doesn't mean that it's the end of the world, but you do have to list it. I will tell you that when it comes to the 4 life questions, there's a few of them. Violence definitely comes into play. So violence with firearms, violence related to drug charges, those things definitely come in. I see here, say someone did not give their 2 weeks notice at a job they previously had. Does that affect the results? I'm not going to say that it couldn't, but I would definitely say that that's not uncommon. What type of job you had may obviously dictate some of those pieces. And I say that because if I'm the IT admin and I want to give, and I give my notice, based on the access I have, the company may say, no, thank you, we'll see you later. And out the door you go, because they're protecting everybody. So it also depends really on what's the setting and why would you have left in the way that you did. Was it because you thought you were going to get fired, so you just quit? Was it because this opportunity came along and you had to go now? Maybe that happened. It really, we'd have to factor some of those things in. The question now comes in, why would a company require security clearance? Simply put, it's because you're working on a classified contract. That company would be, it's the same thing. The company does it, then you're doing it. It's all related to the contract. I think I had one other question in the previous session I think would really apply here as well. And there were some things related to like a DUI, and would that be a reason somebody couldn't be cleared, or if somebody is cleared and they get a DUI, or somebody is cleared and they go through bankruptcy? I will say that people who are cleared go through bankruptcy now. It's not the end of the world. The question is, why are you going bankrupt? What did you do with it? And conversely, when it comes to DUIs, you have to also look at the other aspect of was something else going on related to the DUI? Did you get something like a DUI, and the reason that you got the DUI is because you caused a car accident and killed somebody, you may have a manslaughter charge going on with you as well. Now instead of it being maybe in some cases you might have to go to TAPS and go through some outpatient therapy for it. Now you're actually going to prison. That would be different in that aspect there. I see a question about the green card. That came up last time. The thing about a green card holder is you're not a U.S. citizen. In order to get the clearance, you got to be a U.S. citizen. There's really no way around that except, and as I said, there is the thing called an LAA. You have to be so special, so unique in your skill set that no one else has it. I've never seen that be the case. Myself, I have tried and I have failed on several occasions to help a client go through that process. It didn't work. I've only ever seen an LAA twice in my career. Do we have any other questions that have come in or that somebody hasn't typed out yet? Here's a good one. I've had this question go, okay, so the question is that I have ties to the former Soviet bloc. Yeah, it's not the end of the world. Really, it's not the end of the world at all. Doesn't matter what your native language is. It matters more what your citizenship status is now as a starting point. For example, there are many foreign nationals who have become U.S. citizens, or many people here in the U.S. whose first language is not English. That's okay. And you're going to be a translator in many cases. We're going to send you other places, and we're going to put you in an environment that we need your skill sets. The question that really comes in to play there is, how long have you been a U.S. citizen? And then from there, we get into who you are, what you would access, and who you would access it with, coupled with the family that you may still have in the mother country. That is what would create the issues per se. If I had $1 for every one of the clients and the staff that they cleared, I myself, not my company, related simply put to people that are of Indian, Pakistani, and Eastern European birth that are in these IT industry, I would be able to pay for my son's college education. It is not an uncommon thing, but it really gets to who you are, who the contexts are that you have, where you're working, where they might be working. I shared the story in the last one, had a guy became a U.S. citizen. His company immediately tried to put him in for a clearance. I said, no, wait 3 years. It's unwritten, but wait 3 years. They didn't. Sure enough, he's denied the interim. And the reason he was denied an interim, start and finish, was that he had a family member who was in the Turkish military as an officer. We got a problem. Are there any countries that are restricted from getting a clearance within the DoD or working from the DoD? Not that I am aware of. There are countries that are of greater concern, as one can imagine. But right now, no. I will say, however, that there may be countries that one is restricted from traveling to while they are cleared. And that it would be based upon the level of clearance that you have, the contract that you are working on, the agency that you might be working with may have some of those that create some of the issues. The last one here, if you are rejected or denied, do they tell you? Yes. I thought I had given full notice there, and if I didn't, I apologize. If and when you are denied, you receive a letter that states why you were denied, and it states in that letter when you can or cannot go back in. But they will specifically tell you.